On October 21st, 2003, Elliott Smith was found collapsed inside his Los Angeles apartment. 2 stab wounds driven straight into his chest, his heart pierced, blood spreading across the floor, while the coroner's report left the cause of death unresolved for years. There was no clear suicide note, no direct witness, no definitive conclusion on whether he took his own life or something else happened in that room. 5 years earlier, this same man had stood alone on the Oscar stage, under the brightest lights in the world, singing so softly that the audience had to fall silent just to hear him. So what happened in that short stretch between absolute recognition and a death wrapped in uncertainty? In the end, who or what killed Elliott Smith long before the blade ever touched his skin? 5 years before his death, Elliott Smith reached a moment most musicians spend a lifetime chasing. In 1998, his song Miss Misery was nominated for an Academy Award, pulling a quiet, painfully private indie artist into the most public room on earth. On Oscar night in 1999, he walked onto that stage alone, no band, no spectacle, dressed in a plain white suit that looked almost accidental, and sang in a whisper that cut to the noise of Hollywood like a confession no one was prepared to hear. Millions watched. Applause followed. For the industry, it was a triumph. For Elliott, it felt like exposure without protection. Critics called him the most honest songwriter of his generation. Albums like Either Slash or an EXO were dissected line by line, praised for their vulnerability, their precision, their refusal to perform strength. By the late 1990s, his name circulated everywhere that mattered in music circles. Directors wanted his songs. Labels wanted him bigger. The world wanted more Elliott Smith. Yet behind the recognition, something darker was forming. Each step closer to visibility came with deeper anxiety, heavier dependence on drugs, and a growing fear that the quiet space where his music came from was being invaded. The applause never reached in the way the pressure did. The success never softened the voice inside his head that said he was failing simply by being seen. If this was the peak, the night the world finally listened, why did it feel like the moment everything inside him began to fracture beyond repair? Before the records, before the whispering voice became a signature, Elliott Smith was a child learning how to disappear. Born in 1969, he grew up moving between homes after his parents' divorce, carrying a quiet sense of instability that never left him. Those early years were not defined by music or ambition, but by confusion, fear, and a constant awareness of being out of place. Friends later described him as intelligent, sensitive, and unusually inward even as a boy, someone who observed more than he spoke, someone who learned early that silence could feel safer than expression. Inside the family, tension was not loud, but it was heavy. Elliott has spoken about emotional pressure and control, about feeling watched and judged in ways he couldn't articulate at the time. For a child wired with deep sensitivity, that kind of environment does not simply fade with age. It settles. It becomes a background noise inside the mind, shaping how trust forms, how closeness feels dangerous, and how vulnerability starts to resemble risk. Elliott didn't grow up believing the world was cruel. He grew up believing he himself was the problem within it. Music arrived not as a dream, but as a hiding place. A guitar didn't demand explanations. It didn't interrupt. It didn't look back at him with expectations. Playing alone in his room, Elliott found a space where he could exist without being evaluated, where feelings could pass through sound instead of words. That habit, processing life privately, internally, and quietly, would later become both his gift and his trap. He wasn't learning how to confront pain. He was learning how to absorb it without being seen. By adolescence, the pattern was already clear. Elliott excelled academically, showed talent early, and impressed teachers with his intellect, yet emotionally he stayed guarded. Praise made him uncomfortable. Attention felt invasive. The idea of being fully known by another person triggered anxiety rather than relief. He learned to perform competence while hiding fragility, to appear functional while privately unraveling. The seeds of his later isolation were already planted long before the world ever heard his name. If a child grows up believing that being quiet is the only way to stay safe, what happens when that child becomes an adult the world suddenly demands to speak? When Elliott Smith entered music seriously in the early 1990s, it wasn't because he wanted a stage or an audience. It was because music felt like the only place where he didn't have to explain himself. He played in small bands, recorded with almost no budget, and existed on the margins of the indie scene without trying to break through it. There was no hunger for attention, no desire to be recognized. Music was not a ladder. It was a shelter, unlike many artists of his era. Elliott didn't write songs to perform emotion. He wrote them to contain it. His voice was soft not as an aesthetic choice, but as a psychological reflex. He sang the way someone speaks when they don't want to be overheard. Loudness felt dishonest to him. Projection felt like a lie. The whisper was simply how his thoughts arrived when he was alone. When listeners leaned in to hear him, they weren't being seduced. They were intruding on something deeply private. His early solo work revealed a songwriter unusually precise about internal states. He didn't romanticize sadness or turn pain into spectacle. He described it plainly, almost analytically. Addiction wasn't framed as rebellion. Shame wasn't dramatized. Self-loathing wasn't shouted. It was noted, logged, and folded carefully into melody. Elliott wasn't asking for rescue. He was documenting what it felt like to live without expecting one. That tone set him apart from his peers and quietly defined his entire career. As the mid-1990s progressed, his songwriting became sharper and more disciplined. The melodies grew cleaner, almost comforting, while the lyrics moved further inward. This contrast made the songs unsettling. They sounded gentle, but they carried the emotional weight of someone constantly negotiating with despair. Listeners who discovered his music didn't feel entertained. They felt recognized. Elliott didn't build a broad audience. He attracted a specific one, people who already lived inside their heads and rarely spoke about it. That connection, however, came with a cost. Each time a song resonated deeply with someone else, it reinforced a dangerous internal logic. Pain was no longer just something he endured. It was something that worked. The more accurately he translated his suffering into music, the more valuable it seemed. Without realizing it, Elliott began to associate emotional stability with creative loss and emotional turmoil with artistic truth. Healing started to feel like betrayal, not just his audience, but of his own identity. Music was no longer just an outlet. It became proof that his inner darkness had purpose. And once pain acquires meaning, letting go of it becomes frightening. Elliott wasn't using songs to move through sadness. He was organizing his life around it, refining it, and learning how to live inside it more efficiently. The quieter he became, the more clearly people listened. And the more they listened, the harder it became for him to imagine a self that existed without that sadness at the center. If your deepest wounds are the reason people finally understand you, how do you heal without feeling like you're erasing yourself? By the late 1990s, Elliott Smith could no longer remain hidden. Even if he wanted to, critical acclaim turned into expectation. Small rooms turned into tours. Private songs became public property. Labels asked for reach. Media asked for access. Fans asked for more of the person they believed lived inside the music. What had once been a quiet exchange between a man and his notebook was now a transaction with the world. And every transaction demanded exposure he was never built to give. The contradiction was immediate. The same sensitivity that made his writing precise made visibility unbearable. Interviews felt invasive. Photo shoots felt humiliating. Being discussed as a voice of a generation felt absurd to someone who struggled to speak comfortably at all. Praise didn't register as affirmation. It landed as pressure. Every compliment implied a future obligation. Every success suggested repetition. The more his work was celebrated, the more trapped he felt inside it. Touring magnified everything. Night after night, Elliott was asked to stand in front of strangers and relive the most private corners of his inner life on demand. What listeners experienced as intimacy, he experienced as depletion. The songs did not evolve as he sang them. They reopened. Applause didn't feel like connection. It felt like distance confirmed. He was being seen, but not understood in the way he needed. The audience wanted the sadness intact. The industry needed it consistent. And Elliott felt himself shrinking to preserve it. As the pace increased, so did the coping mechanisms. Drug use escalated not as indulgence, but as anesthesia. It dulled the constant sense of exposure. It quieted the noise of expectation. It softened the fear that he was being watched too closely. At the same time, paranoia crept in. Elliott began to feel scrutinized even when he was alone. Trust eroded. Social interactions became exhausting calculations. The world outside his head grew louder, harsher, and less predictable. Creatively, the tension showed. The music became cleaner, more produced, but also more anxious. There was polish now, but less refuge. The songs still carried beauty, but the calm beneath them was thinning. Elliott was no longer writing solely to survive himself. He was writing under the weight of being needed to sound like suffering. Stability felt like a risk. If he changed too much, would the connection disappear? If the sadness faded, would the music lose its truth? What the public saw was an artist at his peak. What Elliott felt was a narrowing corridor. Success didn't bring freedom. It reduced options. The version of him the world responded to was the one least capable of enduring attention. Each appearance required him to fracture slightly, to perform fragility, while hiding how close it was to collapse. He wasn't being crushed by fame's excess. He was being eroded by its intimacy. If the world finally sees you only when you are at your most vulnerable, how do you step away without feeling like you're abandoning the only version of yourself that anyone wants to keep? By the early 2000s, Elliott Smith was no longer just struggling beneath success. He was unraveling inside it. The coping mechanisms that once dulled the pressure were now driving it deeper. Heroin use became more frequent. Prescription drugs entered the mix. What began as self-medication slowly turned into dependency, not because he was chasing pleasure, but because he was trying to quiet a mind that never stopped attacking itself. Sobriety wasn't framed as recovery in his head. It felt like exposure without armor. Physically, the damage became harder to hide. Weight dropped. Energy disappeared. Friends noticed a change long before the public did. Elliott moved through days exhausted, erratic, often paranoid. He began to believe he was being followed, watched, targeted. These weren't fleeting anxieties. They were persistent fears that shaped how he lived. He isolated himself further, trusting fewer people, retreating into environments that reinforced a sense of threat rather than alleviating it. The world felt unsafe, and his own thoughts offered no refuge. In 2001, the collapse became visible. Elliott disappeared from touring and public life, then reemerged briefly only to alarm those around him. He was hospitalized after a severe breakdown, placed under psychiatric care, and diagnosed with conditions that explained what many had suspected for years: profound depression, anxiety, and escalating paranoia. For the first time, the narrative shifted from troubled artist to man in crisis. Yet even here, recovery wasn't straightforward. Treatment felt invasive. Medication blunted him in ways that frightened him creatively. Stability came at the cost of identity. Elliott had spent his entire adult life translating inner chaos into music. Now he was being asked to quiet that chaos without knowing who he would be if it faded. The fear wasn't just that he would lose his art. It was that without pain, there would be nothing left that felt recognizably him. Attempts at sobriety were uneven. Progress came in fragments, followed by setbacks that deepened his sense of failure. Each relapse reinforced the belief that he was broken beyond repair. During this period, relationships grew strained. Friends tried to help but struggled to reach him through layers of mistrust and shame. Romantic connections became volatile, marked by dependence, conflict, and emotional exhaustion on both sides. Elliott wanted closeness, but feared being known. He wanted help, but resented intervention. Every attempt to stabilize his life felt like a threat to the fragile structure that allowed him to function at all. He wasn't resisting healing out of stubbornness. He was terrified of what healing would take away. Creatively, he was still working, but the process had changed. Songs took longer. Recording sessions were inconsistent. Focus came and went. The music carried a different tension now, not reflective sadness, but fatigue. The voice was still gentle, but the calm behind it was gone. Where earlier work sounded like quiet observation, these songs sounded like endurance. Elliott wasn't writing to understand himself anymore. He was writing to hold himself together long enough to make it through another day. This was a true turning point. Not a single scandal, not one dramatic incident, but a slow realization that the tools he used to survive were now accelerating the collapse they were meant to prevent. He wasn't spiraling loudly. He was eroding silently, piece by piece, while the outside world assumed he was simply going through a phase. The danger wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. If the methods you use to stay alive are the same ones destroying you, how do you choose which version of survival is worth keeping? As the months passed, Elliott Smith tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy without ever fully trusting it. He moved apartments. He changed routines. He attempted sobriety again, this time with a quieter determination. Friends saw moments of clarity return, brief stretches where he seemed more present, more grounded. On the surface, it looked like stabilization. Underneath, the paranoia never truly loosened its grip. It simply learned how to hide better. Elliott became increasingly convinced that danger existed just beyond the edges of everyday life. Ordinary noises felt loaded with intent. Strangers felt suspicious. Coincidences felt like patterns. This wasn't theatrical madness. It was a constant, exhausting vigilance that made rest impossible. Even in moments of calm, his mind scanned for threats. Safety felt temporary, borrowed, something that could vanish without warning. Living like this didn't produce panic attacks. It produced attrition. Day by day, it wore him down. He returned to the studio during this period, trying to work through the fog. The act of recording still mattered to him, but it no longer offered relief. Songs stalled halfway. Ideas dissolved before they could settle. Focus came in flashes, followed by long stretches of disorientation. Elliott wasn't blocked creatively. He was depleted emotionally. The discipline required to finish work now felt monumental. Each completed track cost him more energy than it used to, and he had less to spare. Relationships mirrored this instability. People close to him described a push-and-pull dynamic that intensified over time. Elliott wanted support, but recoiled when it arrived. He feared abandonment, yet interpreted concern as control. Arguments weren't explosive. They were draining, repetitive, and unresolved. The same conversations replayed with different words, circling the same fears without release. He wasn't refusing help. He was unable to accept it without feeling threatened. There were moments when he seemed aware of the pattern. He spoke about wanting peace, about being tired of living inside constant tension. But insight didn't translate into relief. Knowing what was happening didn't make it stop. The gap between understanding and experience widened, and that gap became its own source of despair. Elliott wasn't confused about his pain. He was trapped inside it. By 2003, the contrast between effort and outcome became unbearable. He had tried treatment. He had tried withdrawal. He had tried returning to music as an anchor. None of it delivered the stability he needed. The world around him assumed progress because catastrophe hadn't struck again. But the absence of collapse didn't mean recovery. It meant endurance. And endurance has a limit. In the weeks leading up to his death, those close to Elliott described him as fragile but focused, anxious yet determined to keep moving forward. He wasn't planning a public exit. He wasn't signaling finality. If anything, he seemed caught in the exhausting middle ground between wanting to live and being unable to imagine how. This ambiguity is what makes the end of his story so difficult to interpret. There was no dramatic declaration, no clear turning point. Just a man who had been living at the edge of his capacity for years. When the end came, it did not resolve the questions that preceded it. It amplified them. Whether the final act was intentional or accidental, one truth remains unavoidable. The damage had been accumulating long before that moment. The crisis wasn't sudden. It was prolonged. It wasn't loud. It was relentless. Elliott didn't lose a single battle. He fought too many of them at once, for too long, without rest. If a person spends years surviving minute by minute, how do we recognize the moment when survival itself becomes the most dangerous thing they're doing? By the final stretch of his life, Elliott Smith existed in a state that looked stable from a distance and unbearable up close. He was no longer spiraling publicly. There were no headline scandals, no arrests, no visible implosions. That absence fooled people. It suggested improvement. In reality, Elliott had entered a quieter phase of suffering, one that demanded constant effort just to maintain the appearance of functioning. Every day required calculation. Every interaction required restraint. Living had become an ongoing negotiation with exhaustion. He was still writing, still recording, still trying to move forward. But the process had lost its sense of refuge. Music no longer absorbed the pain. It documented fatigue. Sessions were interrupted by anxiety and mistrust. Momentum collapsed without warning. He could feel ideas forming, but lacked the energy to follow them through. The gap between intention and execution widened, and that gap began to feel like proof that something essential inside him was failing. He wasn't blocked. He was depleted beyond recovery. Physically, the toll was visible. Years of substance use, stress, and inconsistent care had weakened him. Sleep came in fragments. Appetite faded. His body mirrored his mind, tense, fragile, constantly bracing for impact. Even moments of relative calm felt precarious, as if stability were a temporary condition rather than a foundation. He didn't trust good days. He waited for them to end. Emotionally, isolation deepened. Elliott had people around him, but connection remained difficult. Conversation stayed on the surface because depth felt dangerous. Being understood risked being controlled. Being loved risked being trapped. He oscillated between craving closeness and pulling away from it, leaving those around him confused and exhausted. This wasn't cruelty. It was fear expressed through distance. He wanted relief without surrender, help without exposure, peace without vulnerability. There were still flashes of intention. He talked about getting healthier, about finishing projects, about continuing forward. These weren't lies. They were genuine desires. But desire alone couldn't bridge the gap between knowing what he wanted and being able to live inside it. Each attempt to rebuild demanded energy he no longer possessed. Progress felt theoretical. Survival felt practical. And survival required him to keep everything tightly controlled, including his own emotions. What made this period especially tragic was its ambiguity. Elliott wasn't clearly choosing an ending. He was caught in an unresolved middle. He wasn't planning disappearance. He was enduring existence. The danger lay not in a single decision, but in accumulation, years of vigilance, self-monitoring, and internal conflict compressing into something unsustainable. The final years weren't defined by despair alone. They were defined by effort without relief. When someone spends their life translating pain into something beautiful, it's easy to assume that expression itself is healing. Elliott's story challenges that belief. Expression kept him alive for a long time, but it didn't teach him how to rest. It didn't teach him how to feel safe. And eventually, even the act of trying became heavier than the silence he once feared. If a person keeps choosing to live without ever feeling alive, how long can effort alone delay the inevitable breaking point? On October 21st, 2003, Elliott Smith was found inside his Los Angeles apartment with 2 stab wounds to the chest. One pierced his heart. The scene was immediately unsettling, not because of spectacle, but because of improbability. Suicide by stabbing is rare. 2 wounds even rarer. There was no clear note, no definitive timeline that resolved the doubts. The coroner's report listed the manner of death as undetermined, leaving the central question suspended rather than answered. The hours and days that followed did not bring clarity. Accounts conflicted. Interpretations diverged. Some pointed to his long struggle with depression and addiction. Others focused on the physical implausibility, the absence of conclusive explanation, the details that refused to align cleanly with any single narrative. What emerged was not a mystery in the cinematic sense, but an unease that mirrored Elliott's life itself. The end felt incomplete because his suffering had never resolved into a single, obvious cause. What mattered most, however, wasn't choosing a version that felt satisfying. It was acknowledging that the damage did not begin that day. The final act, whatever it was, came after years of erosion, years of vigilance, years of trying to manage pain quietly so it wouldn't spill on others. Whether the blade was intentional or accidental, the war had been ongoing for a long time, and it had already taken almost everything from him. Public reaction oscillated between shock and a dangerous kind of understanding. The narrative of the tortured artist resurfaced, tempting people to connect his brilliance directly to his suffering. But that explanation collapses under scrutiny. Elliott didn't die because he was a genius. He died after spending years without relief, without rest, without a sustainable way to exist in a world that demanded visibility from someone built for privacy. The uncertainty surrounding his death remains because uncertainty defined his final years. There was no clean arc from pain to recovery or from despair to decision. There was only accumulation. pressure layered on pressure until endurance ran out. The unanswered questions are uncomfortable, but they are also honest. They resist simplification. They refuse closure in the same way Elliott's life resisted easy interpretation. If a story ends without a clear explanation, are we meant to solve it, or are we meant to sit with the discomfort of knowing that some suffering never offers answers at all? After his death, Elliott Smith did not become louder. His story didn't crystallize into a slogan. There was no clean moral, no triumphant reframing, no comforting conclusion that made the pain feel justified. What remained was a music, unchanged, uncorrected, still speaking in the same restrained tone that had always asked listeners to come closer rather than step back. In a culture that often rewards certainty, Elliott left behind ambiguity, and that ambiguity became his most honest legacy. Over time, his songs continued to find people who didn't feel represented elsewhere, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. He didn't offer escape. He offered recognition. For listeners living inside their own heads, his work didn't promise solutions. It promised company. That mattered. It still does. His influence quietly spread through generations of musicians who learned that vulnerability didn't have to be performed loudly to be real. That restraint could be as powerful as confession. What Elliott never wanted, to be turned into a symbol, is exactly what people have tried to make of him. The tortured artist narrative lingers because it's easy. It packages complexity into something consumable, but it misses the truth. Elliott's suffering wasn't a creative strategy. It wasn't fuel. It was a condition he lived with, managed imperfectly, and paid for over time. His music didn't exist because he was broken. It existed because he was trying to survive honestly within that brokenness. There is something uncomfortable in admitting that art, no matter how beautiful, does not heal everyone who creates it. Elliott's life forces that recognition. Expression helped him endure, but it didn't protect him. Being heard did not equal being safe. Recognition did not translate into relief. The world learned how to listen to his songs long before it learned how to care for the person making them. And yet, his legacy isn't hopeless. It's instructive. It asks for a different kind of attention. Slower, quieter, less performative. It challenges the idea that pain must be visible to be valid or loud to be taken seriously. Elliott showed that some people are drowning without ever raising their voice. That reality doesn't fit neatly into narratives, but reflects the lives of countless others who move through the world unnoticed. In the end, Elliott Smith didn't leave answers. He left a record of what it sounds like to live with constant internal pressure and still try to be gentle with the world. His whisper remains not as a warning or a myth, but as an invitation to listen more carefully, to stop romanticizing endurance, and to recognize that silence can be a signal, not an absence. If the quietest voices often carry the heaviest weight, are we listening closely enough to hear them before they fade?